The internet is always looking for the next Grand Seiko killer, a luxury watch that offers superb finishing and design while offering good value for money. And usually that takes us to the conversation of the Citizen Chronomaster lineup, which are high accuracy quartz watches that only cost a few $1,000s. And that's usually where the conversation stops because not a lot of watch brands offer luxury quartz watches, so it seems like Grand Seiko has been and always will be at the forefront of luxury quartz watchmaking. But they're actually not the only high-end quartz watches that bear the Seiko name, because about 40 to 50 years ago, there was the Seiko Grand Quartz lineup of watches. And although this lineup was only produced for about a decade, there's tons of history and significance to unpack in these watches, and luckily I have one to share with you guys today. So is the next Grand Seiko killer the Seiko Grand Quartz? Well, let's find out. So before we get to talking about the Seiko Grand Quartz, we need to quickly go over what is Grand Seiko. Well, it's a luxury lineup of Seiko watches that was born in 1960 when its first model, the J14070, was released. It wasn't the only luxury model that Seiko had back in the day, as they also had other luxury models like the Seiko Lord Marvel and King Seiko as well, but Grand Seiko was the only lineup that was successful enough to still exist today. Okay, so technically King Seiko also exists now as they were relaunched pretty recently, but they're not as nearly as successful as Grand Seiko. Grand Seiko flourished enough that in 2017, it branched off into its own independent brand and has gained a respectable reputation in the luxury watch market. However, despite the seemingly overwhelming success of Grand Seiko, it actually did not enjoy a continuous 60-year production, because between 1975 to 1988, Grand Seiko and mechanical watches in general were being pushed aside in favor of a new watchmaking innovation at the time, quartz watches. Now this didn't mean that Seiko gave up on making luxury watches completely, but what it meant was that instead of making King Seiko watches, they made Seiko King Quartz, and instead of Grand Seiko, they created Seiko Grand Quartz. These new quartz models were handed the baton from their mechanical predecessors to continue demonstrating the best of Japanese watchmaking, except for the fact that there was also the Seiko Superior lineup of watches that were actually positioned higher than Grand Quartz and King Quartz models, which meant that Grand Quartz were stuck at being second best of Seiko's quartz lineup. So what happened in 1988? Well, Grand Quartz was retired and they brought back Grand Seiko, and for their first watch for the revival, they made another quartz watch, so why even bother switching back? I think there's a few reasons for this. The first reason is that Grand Seiko has a lot more history behind it. It was the first chronometer rated Japanese watch, and there's a lot more brand recognition with Grand Seiko compared to Grand Quartz. The name Grand Seiko also offers more flexibility. I'm guessing that Seiko was thinking of releasing mechanical watches again, and unfortunately the name Grand Quartz pretty much only limits you to releasing quartz watches. Alright, let's move on to talking about the design of this watch, and let me say that there is gold, lots and lots of gold on this watch. And usually I don't like watches with so much gold, but this watch is an exception. We're going to start off by talking about the gold dust dial. That's what they call it online. You can see that it gives it a very nice texture, and when you see it against the light, it really does reflect it really nicely here. I wouldn't describe the dial as like a yellow gold. It's more like a faint yellow or like a whitish gold color, which makes it less intense, and it does contrast nicely with the case. And just a quick side note, you can actually see a bit of debris between the 10 and 11 o'clock markers right over there, which is a little bit unfortunate, but overall the condition of the dial is really good, especially considering that this is a 50-year-old watch from Japan. A lot of Japanese vintage watches have a lot of water damage because it's such a humid country, but it looks like this one stayed in pretty good condition. It looks like no moisture got inside the watch. Now, a few months ago, I made a video talking about textured dials and how they're kind of a double-edged sword because they can look really good in certain lighting conditions, but then they can look bad in other lighting conditions. But I think this one pulled it off really well, and part of the reason is because if you look at the indices here, they are gold indices, applied indices, but there is that black stripe in the middle, and that makes it really legible. Also, the hour, second, and minute hands all just completely black, so it makes it really legible, really easy to read. And I actually like how these hands are not the typical sword hands. These are just kind of the stick hands. I think it actually looks a lot nicer, and it makes it a lot more unique. An example of a gold watch that has really not that good visibility, and I think it doesn't have enough contrast, is the Grand Seiko SBGR002. That watch is just pure gold with gold hands and indices, gold dial, gold case, and that color of gold is pretty much the same throughout. So I feel like a watch like that just doesn't look as nice compared to this Grand Quartz, just because this one offers different types of gold and also has the black. Even the date window being white, I think that really helps with legibility as well. Also keep in mind that a lot of these design elements prove that this was a premium quartz watch back in the day. You can see that in the applied logo, also the applied symbol beneath it. It makes the watch feel much more premium. This symbol here that looks a little bit explicit, this means that it's a single quartz oscillator as opposed to a twin quartz oscillator, and I'll pull up the symbol for the twin quartz so you can compare it. The single quartz is a little bit less accurate, so these watches are typically a little bit cheaper, but it's still pretty accurate. And then the symbol right below that, that shows that this watch was produced by the Suwa Seikosha factory. There were actually two factories. There was Daini Seikosha and Suwa Seikosha. Alright, so despite all the praise I've been giving this watch, there is one small problem with it, and you can't really see it when you look at the watch dead on, but if you start turning it to the side, you can see what the issue is. So this is a gold-plated watch, but you can see that the gold is starting to tarnish, it's starting to fade away here, and then if I go to the back here, you can see that the gold has just completely peeled off. You know, some parts the gold is just barely hanging on, and I could probably scratch this away with my fingernail. And you can see here that the gold-plated, it is gold-plated, the back is stainless steel. So the stainless steel here is pretty shiny, but the metal underneath that gold plating is just turned to like a dark gray. And when I took this watch to get the battery changed, the watchmaker said that this kind of dark grayish, it probably happened because Japan is quite humid, and also whoever wore this watch probably sweated a lot, and that sweat caused basically like corrosion or like this oxidation to occur. So this part definitely doesn't look very nice. Thankfully, it happened mostly on the back of the watch, which makes sense because that's where your skin contacts the watch. So the front, hopefully the front will stay intact for years to come. Overall, I would say that this watch gives off a lot of Grand Seiko vibes. The case is pretty similar to the 4522-8010 or the 5641-5000, and that gold dust dial is pretty similar to the 6145-8030. So to summarize, I think the Grand Seiko guy put it best. The fact that the word Grand is in Seiko Grand Quartz should be a big enough clue that Grand Seiko never really went away, and the design language in the Grand Quartz really shows that. Also, let me just take a moment here to say how photogenic this watch is. It doesn't seem to matter the angle or the lighting conditions or whether you're looking at this watch from a camera or the human eye, this watch just looks amazing. The gold dust texture is always present and sparkling even in the low light conditions. And what I'm about to say is probably going to trigger some people, but the dial on this watch outshines the Grand Seiko SBGA 427 that I eventually sold last year. One cool little party trick that I learned about the Grand Quartz is that when you pull out the crown to set the time, the seconds hand will actually jump by 10 seconds. So if I pull the crown out here, pay attention to the seconds hand, it will actually jump by 10 seconds. And the reason why, at least from what I read online, is that it jumps by 10 seconds so that you can change the time, push the crown back in, and within 10 seconds you should have been able to set the time, and then the seconds hand will still be accurate. Now let's move on to the wrist shot on my 6-inch wrist. The dimensions are 34mm in diameter, 41mm lug to lug, and 10.6mm in height. Now don't let these seemingly smaller dimensions turn you off. The square case makes this watch wear bigger than the numbers suggest. It looks great on my 6-inch wrist, and I'm sure that people with a 6.5 or even a 7-inch wrist would look good wearing this watch. Now as for the strap, this was not the original strap that it came with when I first bought this watch off Yahoo Auctions Japan. The strap that it came with unfortunately disintegrated while I was at the GS9 event in Brooklyn, New York back in November. So I got a somewhat similar strap to replace it, and this one is also from Yahoo Auctions Japan. I chose this calf leather strap because the burgundy color gives it a nice vintage look, and the gold buckle would match the gold case. I also wanted a strap with Seiko branding on it so that it would better match with the watch. However, I'm not entirely sure if this is a genuine Seiko strap. The reason why I say this is that usually on a pin and buckle strap, there's an indent on the buckle where the pin rests, but this strap doesn't have it. I've never seen this happen before. Even cheap straps will have that indent. So does that mean this buckle is a fake? I guess that's up to the internet to decide. Alright, so now let's talk about the price, which I find really interesting. I was able to get it off of Yahoo Auctions Japan for only 20 Canadian dollars. So why was this so cheap? Well, remember that the condition's not that great with the case and the gold kind of deteriorating. The strap that it came with was falling apart, and the photos that I took for the listing probably weren't the best. Also, when I got the watch, I realized that the battery hatch wasn't staying in properly, so I needed a new gasket. So I needed a new gasket, new battery replacement, a new strap, and all that together was about $90, which is around 130,000 yen today, or about 1,300 Canadian dollars. And when you wear this watch on your wrist, you can tell that this was a premium watch back in the day. This also goes to show that quartz watches lose value much more than mechanical watches, because even the cheapest vintage Grand Seiko mechanical watches will cost you at least a few $100s. So in conclusion, the Seiko Grand Quartz is a watch that represents an interesting time in Seiko's history. It was created as a direct response to the quartz crisis, which was a time where mechanical watches were being phased out in favor of cheaper and more accurate quartz watches. Ironically, Seiko themselves were a major player in the quartz crisis in the first place, which led to them discontinuing Grand Seiko for a while and creating the Grand Quartz lineup. And although Grand Quartz only lasted for about 13 years, they released some very compelling watches during that time, and anyone looking for a high-quality vintage quartz watch should pay attention to the Grand Quartz. This is especially true if you're looking at Grand Seiko's quartz watches, because even though the Grand Seiko quartz is relatively affordable, it's still a few $1,000s, and Grand Quartz is even cheaper, and it's simply a continuation of the mechanical brand updated for the quartz age. And so for all the things that I talked about in this video, the great design, the history, the great price, this watch has earned a permanent spot in my collection. And so going back to my first point, is this the Grand Seiko killer? Well, I would say that the best Grand Seiko killer is the Seiko Grand Quartz. At least for the quartz models. The mechanical and spring drive is a different story. But anyways, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe for more content, and as always, I'll see you guys next time.